Hello, you're very welcome to If I Were the Minister for Education from anseo.net, a regular podcast where I delve into the world of Irish primary education and tell you what I would do if I were the Minister for Education. This is Simon Lewis, and you are either watching this on YouTube or you might be listening to it on your favourite podcasting platform. So I hope if you can't see my screen, I hope you'll be able to visualise what I'm showing you on the screen. If you enjoy the podcast, there's plenty of ways to find me. I write about the Irish primary education system quite a lot. This week, I am interested in the set allocation because by the time you are listening to this, the set allocations might have been published by the Department of Education for 2023. I have spent the last number of days or even weeks looking at the set allocations. And by the way, for those of you who don't know what the set allocations are, they are the special education teaching hours. They used to be known as learning support hours, resource hours. Even if you're very old, they used to be known as remedial teaching, but that's going back a very long way and totally not okay to say anymore. What I'm planning on doing in this episode is going through some of my this sounds very boring, my data analysis. But basically what I'm doing is I basically looked since 2017 at the resources that the Department of Education have put in to special education. And the suspicion has long been that despite the fact the Department of Education are saying that they have increased resources, that most schools aren't feeling that. So that's what I'm going to do today. As I said, I write a lot about the Irish primary education system. If you are interested in reading some of my articles, you can go to my Medium blog, which is simonlewis.medium.com. Some of the articles you'll see there. And if I also pick out some of the news stories, which I find interesting on my Feedly, which you can find in Irish Education News. Interesting Irish education stories. So they're not just Irish education stories. They are also stories from all around the world, which give me an interest. As you can see, some of those there. If you can't, don't worry. Most of all, come along to anseo.net, the website, and click on my newsletter, and you will be able to subscribe to a fortnightly newsletter, which I send out every 2 weeks, as you would expect, telling you all the news I found. This podcast will be shown in this week's newsletter, along with the show notes and some extra resources, as well as the spreadsheet that I use to analyze the data so you can find out information too. I have every single primary school in the country and what their SET allocations were, how they increased or decreased, and what sort of allocation did they get per pupil. So if you're that way inclined, you can compare your school to maybe another school who you think might be doing a bit better than you are and why that might be. So without further ado, let's get into this episode, which is a set allocation special where I have delved deep into the Department of Education statistics page. I have delved deep into the NCSE, the National Council for Special Education allocations page as well for schools. And I have taken all those spreadsheets and I have put them all together through an AI machine. And it has come out with some really interesting statistics. The big question, and I think that most people were wondering, was whether the Department of Education have been slyly cutting the allocations over the last 7 years and whether they're going to plan on doing that again. And the other big question that I asked people, would they be interested in, and it's been the big question for a lot of primary schools, is whether developing schools have been harder hit than non-developing schools in terms of resources. Anyone who's in a developing school will have told you that they think that is the case. And one of the reasons for that, and I have a personal experience of this, is when your school is growing. So back in 2017, when this was all invented, schools were given an allocation based on 5 different criteria. Now, I won't go through the 5 criteria. It's not that interesting. But generally, it was fairly scientific, and most schools were given an allocation. Whether schools agreed with that allocation or not, it was based on some algorithm, and very closely to that algorithm. However, after that, in 2019, things got a little bit hairy, where schools were losing numbers their allocation didn't seem to change very much. And when schools were gaining numbers, they weren't really given the resources that they might have expected. In fact, if you increased by one class, so a normal developing school, you would receive an extra three hours of allocation per week, which sounds like it might be quite good. It isn't really. 3 hours per week for an extra class. If you think about your own class, and I would suggest maybe at least between 10, I'd say about 10 to 25% of the children in your class will have had a diagnosed additional need, more than likely. So back in the olden days, when I started teaching, you used to be able to get a certain number of hours of resource teaching, depending on the diagnosis. So if it was autism, it was 5 hours a week. So you can see already, if you have one autistic child in your class and you're being given just 3 hours for a full class, you can see how very quickly, if you have 3 autistic children in your class, which is quite regular these days, you're looking at missing 15 extra hours a week, go down to 3 hours a week. So you can see why developing schools might have thought that this new way of allocating the resource, the hours, wasn't going to really do them much good. So rather than me ranting and raving and saying what I think is going to happen, let's actually look at the statistics. And what I'm going to do, if you are watching this on YouTube, is I'm going to go through a thread that I created on Twitter to guide me in this. If you're listening, don't worry. As I said, I hope you'll be able to follow along. And this thread is a thread I wrote about my allocations. I'm going to flip between that and the actual spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is there. It's a lot of numbers all over the place. And I hope you'll be able to follow along if you're watching. But for the benefit of listeners, as I said, keep repeating myself. As I said, don't worry, I will be explaining things as I go along. Essentially, my question is, are children being screwed over by the set allocations, which, by the way, are allocated by the NCSE, I presume with the Department of Education? I think the NCSE are tasked with allocating the hours. And I suppose I should remind you, for those of you who don't know this, the NCSE do not have any data on children's needs. They have no idea what children have what needs, and they rely very much on external data, which again, I don't know how they're getting it, where they're getting it from, because they're not allowed to have data unless they get parents' consent. And I can't see them getting that even every 2 years when they don't keep it. So I'm not really sure where they're getting their data. But that aside, they have their algorithm. And I guess what most people are agreeing is that despite the Department of Education claiming that they're allocating more SET hours given to schools and to children, it just feels like we're getting less. And I think the reason for that, personally, is I think there's more children coming into schools with additional needs than there used to be. And I'm not saying that as a disparaging sort of comment. It is just the way things are. Children are coming to school with more educational needs. They're coming to school with more therapeutic needs, physical needs, care needs, and plenty of children are coming in with diagnosed and undiagnosed conditions as well. And classrooms are very different in terms of the needs that are there now than they were maybe 20 years ago when I started teaching. If I had one child in my class with additional needs, I would generally have an SNA automatically. It's interesting. I imagine if I was thinking of the very first class I ever taught and thinking of who was in that, I had a special needs assistant in that class. There is absolutely no way I would have had a special needs assistant if I was teaching that class today. Anyhow, I decided, rather than feeling it, because that's where the feeling is, I wonder, was there any kind of data to back that up? I looked, before I looked at a really good survey, which is from the National Principals Forum. They did a survey on special education needs, and it was called the Inclusion Illusion, which is just loading up behind me here. And the Inclusion Illusion was a really good study. I think it was in 2019 or 2020. And it was a survey of Irish primary school principals and special education provision in schools. And really it asked principals lots of questions, and over nearly 1,000 principals replied to the survey, 905 principals in total. And it went through a number of things. And I'm just scrolling towards what they talked about in special education. Most of them believed there was a lack of time and resources when it came to working with children with additional needs. Lots of other things, lack of S&A allocation, lack of support from the Department of Education. But it talked about how often special education teachers had to cover mainstream classes, which was most teachers. That hasn't changed at all. They went on and talked about the set allocations, which is what I want to focus on. And essentially, they believed, this was the belief, that they were asked to rate how much resources they would have got in an older model. So there was an older model back in the day where you were given resource hours depending on the diagnoses that the children had, and you had the baseline hours as well. And they believed if you would have more hours, would you have more hours under the new model or less hours under the new model? And 43.5% said they'd have more hours than the older model was in place. But if you cut the 15%, so there was a 15% cut to resource hours in 2012, if that was in place, that went up to 88%. So 88%, so nearly 9 out of 10 principals believed that they're getting less hours than they used to from the previous model. It's hard to know whether that's true. That's self-reporting stuff. So all we can do really is go on the facts as they are. And so let's find out if they're right. I went off and converted lots of documents from PDFs to Excel, from Excels into other things. And essentially, after putting all these documents together, the set allocations together, I came up with the answer, essentially, which was, did we get more hours overall? And the answer, to be honest, was it depends. It depends on how you look at it, really. Overall, taking absolutely everything into account with set allocations, the government has increased set allocations since 2017. There is no doubt about that. In fact, they have gone up by a massive, what do you think? 0.2%. Barely marginal. So technically, the Department of Education aren't lying when they say there's more supports, even if it is less, not even less than 1%, less than 0.1% per year. Rubbish, really. However, the story doesn't stop there. They could have given no increase whatsoever at all. It's just barely an increase, and I don't think they could boast about it. But let's break it down a bit, because I think when you look at it, let's say in smaller groups, let's look at counties, for example. Some counties in Ireland have had a really large increase in population. And that's interesting because there's some counties that have had a massive decrease in population. And I wanted to maybe show you a little bit of the database on that by county. So I have everyone by county here. In this case, I have everyone sorted by where they landed in terms of goodness. So I'm going to sort that by alphabetical order just so people can see it. And essentially, what I found was there was a lot of counties that went up overall from 2017 to 2021. I have them color-coded here. If they're in red, they went down. If they're in green, they went up a bit. But you can't see this if you're listening, but it's very varied. There's some counties, and I'm going to pick on two here really, which are Offaly and Roscommon, because they're right beside each other alphabetically, and they both tell very different stories. Two stories of extremes, in fact. Offaly's population of children in schools went down by 4.69%. That's quite a lot of children, by the way. And their average allocation went up by 7.1%. So despite the fact that the population went down significantly, their allocation went up significantly. And then in Roscommon, their population of children went up by 4.6%, 4.666%, but their allocations went down by 4.5%. This is per pupil, average per pupil. So in effect, if you take population increase and decrease, what you find is Offaly has had an 11% increase in their allocations per pupil. And Roscommon has lost nearly 10% of allocations when you adjust for population, which is amazing. Now, you'd expect a margin of error of some point, maybe 2%, if that. But I find that astonishing that there were counted. And there's a lot of them. Let me tell you a bit more. So Roscommon was the worst affected, just a discrepancy of 9 and a bit percent, 9.3%, what they should have, they're down. Laois is next, they had a big population increase, probably the second biggest population increase in the country. They're down 4.6% of where they should be. Dublin down 2.5%, Monaghan down 3.8%, Leitrim down 2.6%, and it goes on really. Westmeath down 2.6% before it gets to margins of error you'd accept. So I'd say about 2% is an acceptable level. Longford's down 1%, Meath is barely, marginal, and so on. But when you look at this and you look at Offaly, and by the way, Offaly, which I don't know, it's a coincidence. Of course, it's a coincidence. But when it was coming to the STEM grants, you remember the STEM grants there that went out by lottery there? Offaly had the highest number of grants per capita. I actually looked up the general secretary, is it, of the Department of Education to make sure she wasn't from Offaly. She isn't, by the way. But yeah, just because it seemed really bizarre that on the last two things in these studies, Offaly just seems to randomly do much better than everybody else. And then I was like, is because the building section of the Department of Education technically is in Tullamore and Offaly. Maybe there's somebody in there doing the work there because their kids go to the school. That's mad conspiracy theory stuff. And then I thought, wait a second, Roscommon is where some of Athlone is, and Westmeath certainly, and Westmeath and Roscommon are in the top 10 of schools that were screwed over, really, or the counties that were screwed over. So I don't think so. Yeah, but I don't know. It's a bit weird, I think, all that. And so look, it seems that Offaly are the real winners when you divide it by county. And if you give, and just I mentioned this margin of error of 2%, looking at that, only 11 counties had an allocation that fell into that margin of error. So 15 counties are way off, either in a good way for them or in a bad way for some as well. For most of them, actually, which is interesting as well. I think 10 out of the 11 of those counties, 10 out of those 15 counties are under where they should be. But what conclusion can we make from looking at counties? I suppose the answer is you can't. You can't really, because it's pointless. There's no pattern. You would expect that everybody would go down or everybody would go up. But county by county doesn't really tell any particular story. It's not, I mean, you could try and, I was joking about Offaly and the conspiracy theory there, where you could look at the ministers that are in charge of particular counties. Are they doing better? I don't think that it works that way. I actually think what happened simply was they started off with an algorithm based on some sort of logic, and then they just threw it out because what we do know is many schools that lost enrollments didn't lose their set allocations. And you can have a look at your own schools around your area on the set allocation spreadsheet. I have it by every school here. If we just randomly go down somewhere here, so this is St. Oliver's National School in Louth. In 2000, I'm reading this for the sake of listeners here. In 2007, they had 166 students. I've literally chosen this randomly, so I don't actually know what the figures are, and I don't even know the school, so I'm not picking on them. So apologies if you are involved in that school. It's nothing personal, and it looks very average, actually, to be honest with you. 166 pupils, 65 allocation hours, 0.39 per pupil is where we went. If you go on then to 2019, they stayed exactly the same, but their allocation went up by 2.5 hours. I don't know why that would be. And I'm not going to hazard a guess as to why. And then, so that meant they had a bit of a discrepancy, just being one school. They stayed at 166 the following year and remained where they were. So a boring school, really. They didn't really have much change. They gained an extra 2.5 hours, let's say, per week and we don't really know why that was. They obviously applied for that and got it or something like that. Whereas, let's say, look at a school here, Cloyne, a boys' national school in Cork. They started off with 287 students, 135 allocations, so about fairly high allocation per pupil, higher than the previous school there. They went up by 31 students the following year, but remained on the same allocation. So their allocation went down to, let's say, more average levels, but even though they went up by 10%, the following year they went up again to 336. And this time they did, and this time again, they did not increase their allocation. So they developed twice as a school, more or less, and didn't get extra allocations. I wonder why that was. They should have. But basically, as a result of that, over the years, they have had a discrepancy. They're down 17% of the allocation they should have based on their original thing. So there's just two examples of two schools that I randomly picked from the database. So you can check that out yourself just to see where your school might land. But really, I think looking at counties is a bit pointless. Looking at individual schools in some ways is a bit pointless too, because every school is slightly different. I know schools could ring up the NCSE and say, hey, you made a mistake here. What's going on? I have this child. Why have this child came from this school or whatever it might be. And they might have thrown you a couple of extra hours. It was rare they took them away. But you can have a look to see how that worked. So really the only way of getting any statistics really, okay, county wasn't great, but developing schools, if you group together all schools that were developing and then you compare them to schools that aren't developing, so schools that didn't go up significantly in their enrollments, you can get a good picture of how it worked. Now, this is never going to be 100% accurate because the algorithm for calculating who a developing school is can be tricky to do. I basically made a good stab at it, so it's not going to be far away without being really very accurate. And I think anyone who works in a developing school would be shocked if developing schools weren't treated less favourably. However, it was how badly they were treated that actually blew my mind away. Now, suppose if you're watching this, here's the result. I'm going to read it out to you. Developing schools increased their enrolment nationally by 27.8%. That's a huge jump by any stretch of the imagination. But their allocation only increased by 7.6%. So if you have an enrolment change of 27.8%, you would expect the allocation change based on using all of the schools as your sample, because there's a lot of schools, to be the same or roughly the same, in and around between 25 and 30%. But it's only down at 7%. So that meant that the average pupil is getting 15.75% less hours than than children that go to a non-developing school. But it gets worse than that, because if you I was looking up, and I'm not a statistician by any stretch of the imagination. This could be wrong because it's so shocking that I am really questioning myself if I'm right or not. And I maybe, even if I'm a little bit wrong, I don't think I'm madly wrong. But when you talk about a discrepancy then, so based on the enrollment change, and then you take away with the resources they should have had, you should be able to get the discrepancy. They're getting 15% less than they were getting in 2017. That means that they're getting in total 43% less support than children in non-developing schools. 43%. Now, as I said, the figure is so shocking. People will probably say that can't be right. And as I said, I'm not a statistician, so I may be wrong. However, whatever it is, it's definitely more than 15%, which is shocking in the first place. In some ways, it doesn't really matter what the figure is. It shouldn't be more than 15%. It shouldn't be more than 1%. It shouldn't be more than 2% anyway. It's shocking. Whereas, if you're in a non-developing school, even though your enrollment changed, so the enrollment changes overall in all the non-developing schools, the population went down by 3.38%. Your allocations, thankfully, went down minimally by 0%, 0.5%, almost not by nothing. So very little change in that. So in other words, pupils in non-developing schools are getting more support per pupil, and the discrepancy is about 6%. So they're getting 6% more than they should be getting. That doesn't sound like a lot, but there are a lot more non-developing schools than developing schools. And when you look at the discrepancy for developing schools, what you can really see there is, from the start there, the Department of Education might be putting in total more hours, to schools, but they're basically instead of basically using the hours for the new schools, they're basically making up for the fact that they don't want to take away hours from non-developing schools. Politically, it would be a nightmare. Can you imagine the drama if you had a school with, let's say they had, 100 set hours, and then their population went down by, 30 pupils or 50 pupils or whatever else, and then their set hours went down to 80. That's a teaching position gone. Do you know what I mean? What politician in the right mind is going to reduce those hours? Even if it's the right thing to do, I can absolutely imagine why they wouldn't do it. So why in the hell did they put that algorithm in the first place is beyond me. I'm not really sure why that is. So essentially, that's like the big news. Developing schools were screwed over, and it's very likely in the next allocations they'll still be screwed over. I am told by a reliable source that the Department of Education have acknowledged this, and they said that they are going to be what's the word? Vigilant? Vigilant might not be the word. They're going to be anyway. They're going to look into it when they're doing the new hours when they come around. I will, of course, be analysing those to see if they have, in fact, been listening or not. I also did just because I'm obsessed with patronage, I also did a comparison by patron. It isn't very useful, only for the fact, and I'm sharing the spreadsheet there for you there, only for the fact that it doesn't really give you much information. And here is the information, just if you are interested. Yeah, you can see here that multi-denominational schools have gone up significantly by 30.38% since 2017 to 2021, as did Jewish and Muslim schools. And you can see Catholic schools have gone down, so Church of Ireland schools and other Christian denominations, and these are interdenominational schools. And then it talks about their allocation changes, which look good on the surface, but actually in Catholic schools and Church of Ireland schools, they've remained where they possibly should. In a way, interdenominational schools have done better than they possibly should. But look, that's the thing about this is you can overanalyze these things and say, oh, it's against this, it's against that. To be honest, this is just really because multi-denominational schools and Muslim and Jewish schools have gone up in enrollments, as you'd expect, because I think a new Muslim school opened between 2017 and 2021. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure their enrollment increased significantly. I think maybe there was an extension to one of the schools. And we know that in the last number of years, multi-denominational schools are the only shows in town in terms of new schools, quite rightly. So I guess there's that really is there for informational purposes. As I said, there's developing schools. We've got all schools there as well, which is maybe of use to you as well. So I don't know, that is really all I have. The main takeaway for me is while there were slightly higher resources put into the system in general, developing schools lost out majorly as schools that lost enrollments maintained most of, or at least all of their allocations. So there's not really much to say, except we really need to make people aware of it. I've done my maths. If you know anyone who might think the story is scandalous, maybe tell them, particularly if they're a journalist or the media, because since publishing it, I really haven't heard anything. It's a bit of an anticlimax for me. I thought, oh my gosh, this is a massive story, which it is. Developing schools, we now have the facts for sure that they have been terribly, majorly screwed over when it comes to allocations. And that's not the schools. I'm not calling it. It's the children in these schools, children with additional needs who need the support of teachers from the special education teacher team that are losing out. This isn't about developing schools just whinging. There's a reason why we do our jobs, and that is to help our children learn. And if we're not being treated equally, certainly in terms of resourcing, that's problematic. And developing schools are not just multi-denominational schools. There are Welsh schools, there are Catholic schools that are also developing. There are many Catholic schools expanding all the time. But this is not really about ethos. In fact, it isn't at all. This is simply about providing the resources that children with additional needs require. Simple as that. If I were the Minister for Education, I would be halting whatever allocations I was about to put out there if I was imminently. And I would be going back and I would be looking at that algorithm and I would be making sure that every single school is getting the correct allocations that they require for special education teaching. And I would make sure that in the first place, they are adequate enough. Because as I said, nearly 9 out of 10 principals do not believe they have enough resources or close to the resources that they had back in the day. And it's something that even sometimes as we thought, perception was real. Developing schools were being screwed over. And I would not be surprised if the perception about us getting enough resources is also, in fact, I know it's real. When I'm at principal meetings, it's almost the only thing we talk about is the lack of resources for children with additional needs. If I were the Minister for Education, I'd be going back to the drawing board and I would be recalculating the set allocation hours. So there you have it. I hope you enjoyed that run through of the set allocation resources. Pretty scandalous in my opinion that developing schools have effectively been overlooked and I suppose overcompensation given to schools that weren't. Essentially, the Department of Education should really have just given the resources that were needed. We were right in the end. So listen, as I said, that's it from me for this week. If you'd like to subscribe to the newsletter where you'll find loads more information on this set allocations, you can go to onshaw.net/subscribe, or you can just go to onshaw.net and have a look at some more of the data that I've put online as well, including a facility to search for your own school and how well they did. Anyway, that's it from me. Thanks so much for listening and for watching. All the very best. Bye bye.